Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this special panel for the LLF. And I'm really pleased and honored to join some distinguished writers and those who have worked and written about food in the South Asian context. And we are going to talk to them about their food writing, about food, what food represents, how it intersects with our culture, memory, our present, and futures, of course. We have Claire Chambers with us, who has recently edited this volume. And we'll be talking a bit more about this in the session. I'm also joined by Sanam Maher, who needs no introduction. Sanam is an author and a journalist. She's based in Karachi, and her essay in this volume is about burgers, and we shall explore that in detail once we get to that. I'm also joined and really happy to see Rana Safvi, who is a dear friend of mine, and of course, she's a very well-known author. She's authored many books on Delhi, on India's past. She's translated many works from Urdu into English, and she's also a great lover of food and a real cuisine specialist, and she has been collecting recipes and cookbooks for years and years, and we'll talk about that. And last but not the least is Sultana Al Quaiti, who in 2014 published a lovely booklet based on the recipes that her mother had collected and passed on to her children, and we shall be talking about that. And before I go start, I would also like to tell everyone that Claire Chambers is a professor of global literature at the University of York. And this is not her first book or her only book. She's a prolific author and, of course, a great teacher. And Claire, so I'll start with you right away. Why this book and what prompted you to put together this lovely collection?
Thank you, Raza. So it started with a year that I had in Pakistan when I was very young, teaching English in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, which was really a formative year for me. And that set me off because I'd always been passionate about literature. But from then on, it was always South Asian literature for me. And that's where my sort of research journey began. And simultaneously, I also fell in love with South Asian food because you can imagine in KP, I was treated with great hospitality and fed an awful lot. Most people go to the subcontinent and lose weight, but I put on several stone in a very happy way. And then I did, my most recent academic book was a monograph about the five senses in relation to British Muslim writing. So I did chapters on taste, smell, touch, hearing, and the taste chapter was really fun to write, very interesting to think about migration and race and memory through the lens of food. So then a friend of mine, the historian Siobhan Lambert-Hurley from the University of Sheffield, was working on a project funded by GCRF, or Global Challenges Research Fund money. And the project's called Forgotten Food, Culinary Memory, Local Heritage and Lost Agricultural Varieties in India. And we were talking and I was telling her about my research interest. So she very kindly invited me to get involved. So, and Rana is another project partner on this. We have some other wonderful people like Tarana Hussain Khan and Saraf Hussain, and also these are people who contributed to the volume. So it brings together lots of different sorts of research. So with Siobhan being history, myself doing literature, we even have plant scientists who are looking at heritage varieties of rice so that they're actually growing these varieties to see what it is in the taste and the texture that we might bring into new varieties in the future. I mean, it's really quite unusual to have these complete mix of researchers working in the context of climate change and changing attitudes to to food in the 21st century. And my part was I offered to produce an anthology. I thought it would be lovely. I'd done an anthology about love quite recently, about love and relationships. So I drew on some of my connections and brought together this volume. So it's 9 life writing essays in the first half. Both Sanam and Rana Appa have contributed essays to that half. And the second half is fiction, so short stories, all about food, very different aspects of food, gastronomy, and so forth.
Lovely. I mean, I did take a very quick look and read many of the essays. I think it's a fabulous anthology, but we'll talk more about that. Its compilation. I do want to, because you mentioned the first part has these longer essays, and one of the most readable essays is that by Sanam Maher. And I would like Sanam very much to talk about your piece on burgers and what they represent in the contemporary Pakistani culture, and how it's both a representation of the fused culinary habits, but also burger serves as a political allegory throughout the essay. So maybe you can elaborate that and also talk about your essay and how and when and why you wrote it.
Yeah, I wrote this for, I think it was back in 2016, I believe. I wrote this piece for Al Jazeera because they were doing a series on how food in different cultures can mean certain things, or how it can shape a culture around it. And it just so happened that Claire, when she reached out to me, I really wanted to do a new piece for her. I wanted to find something like a lot of different areas of food that I'd been interested in. But it just so happened, because of the pandemic, obviously, we're restricted in terms of what reporting we can do. And I didn't think she would go for this, but I was like, here's a piece I did on burgers. I really enjoyed it. I really had a lot of fun with it. And are you interested? And it fit this sort of theme really nicely. But the thing that really drew me to this initially was I had grown up hearing this term burger. It was so common to describe someone as a burger. It's one of those phrases, I think, where it's so common over here, when you're trying to explain it to an outsider, you stumble a little bit. And from 2013 onwards, particularly, I think, when we've seen the rise of the PTI and Imran Khan, we've seen this term come into just even when we're reporting on the party. We saw this term being used a lot more to describe the young voters that he was really resonating with. And I became more interested in how there was 2 things. So one, the term that has been around for as long as I can remember. And secondly, Mr. Burger, which is almost like it's a Karachi institution. It's one of those places that has been around since we were kids. It's just so common over here. I mean, I remember even just friends or family in other cities, like if you'd be traveling there, they'd ask you to bring it with them, or they really remembered it. It stands out as a thing that they've eaten over here. And then as this term burger began to be used so frequently to describe this new political class that suddenly had a lot of clout, and you were seeing that they knew how to use social media, put forth of this party that they really supported, I became interested in the burger come about. And in looking at that, I started to look at the history of how the burger came to Pakistan. It's this part of food culture here that's now just so ubiquitous. I can't remember a time before that. But I mean, now McDonald's and things like that are such a part of the food landscape here that we don't remember what it was like before them. And how did this very American food item come to this country? How was it introduced over here? And I went to Mr. Burger. I met the family that started it up, and they just had such a fascinating story, which really, at the end of the day, was this story of ambition and imagination. Like, to imagine that you're going to take this thing that doesn't exist in this culture and to bring it here, to create an entire sort of industry around it, to start from scratch, and to have the idea that it is going to work, and to have the imagination to do it. And when I say from scratch, I literally mean everything from not having sliced cheese available in the country. How do you begin to explain to a dairy producer, I want sliced cheese? And creating a culture really around fast food and what it's become today, and how it's just become such a part of our lives. We don't even question it. So I was really interested in exploring a lot of those things. And the family just has a fascinating history. There was so much that came out. I mean, the Mr. Burger logo, if any of you have ever seen it, I didn't know that it was three brothers that started up Mr. Burger. And the logo was created by a man that in Paris, like near the Champs-Elysees, a man who was sketching on the street. And this is back in 1978. And one of the brothers saw him and went up to him and said, I'm starting this company up in Pakistan, and this is the idea. And he sketched out the logo, and that's the logo we see today. So I think those food histories and bringing that in, I had such a fun time with it, and got a lot of free burgers also, by the way, which was great.
Yeah, it was worth the effort for sure. But Sanam,
Oh, my friends, I think this is the only piece I probably worked on where they truly were like, stretch this out as long as you can. This is great. This is great for us. Yeah.
I know, and it's really fascinating because after rereading your essay this time, I realized how this transformation. I mean, because I have also witnessed it in my lifetime. When we were young, burger was a rare,
Yeah.
foreign item you would sort of navigate and hunt for. And there were just few outlets in Lahore where I grew up, and now it's like it's been indigenized, with the street food, with the types of anda burger that we have, and egg omelette burger, or so all kinds of variations, and it is quite a journey. But I guess talking about journeys, we'll sort of take a look back to the more historical and more authentic recipes that Rana Safvi has mentioned in her essay on korma and kalia, and how central that has been to the cultural milieu where she grew up, and how it is treated and how it is distinguished from other kinds of curries. So, Rana, over to you. Tell us a bit about your essay and the centrality of korma in the cuisine that you grew up with. Yeah.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Iman, for the invitation. And food is something I've always loved ever since I was a child. For me, travel meant food because I grew up reading Indian Platons. So from the fatty find outers, for me, England meant eclairs and macaroons, and for me, America meant burgers. And there was a time when I wanted to go to America just to eat a burger. It was that foreign. So I loved Sanam's story. I read it, and I love the way she's treated it as a metaphor. And in my story, we grew up in I shouldn't say that it was a very conservative house. Our house was very liberal, but we were pretty conservative about traditions and trying to keep, because my father was in the police service and in a transferable job. So my mother tried to keep as many traditions as possible, in considering that every few years, sometimes the months, we would be shifted to a new place. So, there were some things that were sacrosanct, some especially recipes, the family recipes. And we grew up hearing the difference between kalia and korma. Today, people actually don't understand. And these are just generic terms which everybody uses, and, they come up with whatever recipe they want and they give it some name. I remember I think must have been very young when I heard this term, you want to go to you want to run a restaurant, you want to make a dish popular, give it the name of a Mughal emperor. Make it Jahangiri Korma, Nurjahani Pulao, and it'll do well. It doesn't matter what you put in it. So, these are things that we grew up with. And, the culture of the Dastarkhan, as Claire mentioned, jo wo dua padhte hain khana khane se pehle, then, sending thanks to God for, shukrana after eating it. These are things which were very central to our lives and which still are, and which we've tried to preserve. The fact that sitting at a dining table meant that there was this saying in our house that the longer you sit at a dining table, us waqt ka hisab nahi hoga. Because Qayamat ke din, you're supposed to be giving an account of each moment that you've spent and what you've spent it in. So we were told as children that if you sit at the dining table, you don't have to account for that portion of your life. So we would sit at the dining table. And, now I realize that was the time when we heard stories. There were so many moral stories that were told to us. We heard family law, we heard, family stories, came to know about each other. Otherwise, life, everybody was busy even in those days with their homework, work, whatever that we were doing. So these were a lot of fun times, whether at the dining table or sometimes in the kitchen also, in the Bawarchi Khana around a wood fire. I still remember in my grandmother's house, sitting on those small peedis, those wooden stools, and hot rotis would be, chapatis would be coming off the tawa from that wood chulha, and we would be sitting around, waiting for our turn. And so these are very warm memories that I have. And korma is something, again, which was not cooked very often at home. With that, a korma meant a dawat. And for us growing up, chicken korma was actually the rarest of kormas, because mutton is something we ate every day. But chicken was not so popular as it is now. Today, if we talk meat, we normally mean chicken. But for us, chicken was something very rare. It's only in India, at least, that Venki's popularized it in the 70s and 80s, and it became, much cheaper. Otherwise, it used to be quite expensive. And there's this book that I keep referring to, Abdul Halim Sharar, who wrote in the late 19th, early 20th century. He wrote a book called Guzishta Lucknow, in which he talks about that the chicken that were served on the Nawabi Dastarkhan, they were fed on saffron and musk. And I totally agree with him, because I find the meat very bland. I don't really like chicken. I much prefer mutton, I think, because of the blandness. And so I remember that these are things which were running through my mind when I was writing this essay. And the fact that people, when they, I remember I did one food promotion for ITC, and my aunt, now she is no longer there, but she was the one who gave me most of our family recipes from Jaunpur. And she gave me this recipe for korma and for Ran Musallam. And when it was ready, of course, it was prepared as per my recipe. And afterwards, it was garnished with hara dhania. And I was showing this picture to Apia, and she said, "Ye kya kiya? Hara dhania kyun dal diya?" And, these are things which people don't even think twice, but these are things which are associated with memories in our mind, that if you use haldi, that means it's a kalia, you add vegetables to it. A very, insidious conspiracy by the ladies to make the men eat vegetables. So you have all vegetables put into the kalia. So, especially now it's winter, so shaljam patta gosht and, gobi ka salan and all those vegetables would be chukandar. All these vegetables would be used with meat. And korma, as I said, was only meat, braised meat, and without any haldi. And it would be served only once in a while and for occasions. And even today in our house now, though not that we don't eat meat so often now, but even then, korma is still for feasts. And in my mind, korma jo bhi ho, whichever meat it is used, chahe it is butter or it is, mutton or chicken or fish, whatever, the kormas are basically meant. There's a festivity going on, there's a feast, there's a dawat, Eid hai, Bakrid hai, Shadi hai, something like that is when we will cook korma. Otherwise, normal everyday food will be kalia, which is mutton stew or a chicken, mostly mutton stew with vegetables and turmeric used, and which will be garnished with hara dhania, something I love.
Yeah. So I also, in your essay, Rana Appa, you say that your grandmother said that masala aise bhuno jaise dushman ka kaleja. So fry the spices as if you were to be, I don't know what, frying the liver of your enemy or something. I mean, as drastic as that. But so tell us about that context, because bhuno is the gosht. The important part of cooking mutton in our part of the world is how well you fry it, right?
you roast or saute the masalas or the spices? Because my husband, I mentioned, I don't know whether I mentioned it in the story or not. I mentioned it in a piece that I did for Scroll as part of our forgotten food culinary memories. My husband's allergic to cardamom. So when we got married, the khansama came from Lucknow, and as was the norm, he started giving all the masalas that had to become. And he said ilaichi, and my mother said ilaichi to nahi aayegi, दूल्हा allergic hai. And the khansama said, Begum sahab, aap mujhse pehle कहती तो मैं आता नहीं, मेरी नाक कट जाएगी. So now I cook without any garam masala. And I realized that what my grandmother used to always say, my grandmother was a very good cook. My mother was very indifferent to food. So I learned cooking from my grandmother and my aunts. So my grandmother would always say that, the trick to the salan, and, जिसको कहते हैं खुश रंग salan. Okay, बिल्कुल, it should not be dull. It should be a very bright color.
Good looking salan.
सबसे पहले आंखें खाती हैं, तो खुश रंग सालन के लिए आपको मसाला भूनना पड़ेगा, and that requires a lot of patience. And I think I was in college when there was some niyaz or dastarkhan in our house, and I remember Dadi cooking the korma, and she must have bhunod it for at least over an hour. And I asked her, Dadi, इतना भून रही हैं आप? तो बहुत हंस के बोली, she said, बेटा मसाला ऐसे भूनो जैसे दुश्मन का कलेजा. And that has been an abiding memory for me, and something which I follow to the T, that masala is what, the more you bhuno the masala, and you have to know the trick, that when it's just right and it's done, and वो masala तेल side छोड़ देता है, रंग खुश बिल्कुल बढ़िया हो जाता है. And for that you will never need spices, which is something that I feel that lazy cooks drown their food in spices and oil, which is something that I don't really like. So I prefer bhunoing it patiently and bringing out the taste of the meat and the masalas that I am using, instead of just an overbearing taste of spices.
Yeah, because I was intrigued by the bhuno or the deep fry or roast metaphor in your book, because when I learned how to cook, I was a student in the UK, so I had no choice but to learn how to cook our food, and I did not take the advice very seriously about frying the meat and the spices, and it would never come, I would never get it right. So only with time I've realized how important that part is. So I'll go to Sultana Al Quaiti, who, as I mentioned earlier, has put together some recipes from her mother in 2014 in the form of a booklet. And I would like to ask you tell us about that booklet in detail, and about your mother's style of cook. Yeah, there it is, and the style, but also what how food is linked to memory and nostalgia, because I'm sure part of that has gone into the book as well. The love for your mother's memories, right? Yes.
Thank you so much, Raza. Can I share the screen now with some photographs my mother, Begum Pyari Rashid, had been actively involved in the freedom movement from 1935. And she'd also been a member of the All India Muslim League. She moved to London in 1946, where she then founded the All Pakistan Women's Association, known in Pakistan as APWA. She founded the London branch, and she served as its treasurer and secretary for many years, and was a founder of the Pakistan Society of Great Britain in 1951. Because of her own background in Lucknow with cooking, she loved to promote Pakistan gastronomically and culturally. I remember Laila Haroon once told me that in 1952, when she and Lady Haroon visited me in London, she was amazed to find that my mother was producing the most amazing Pakistani cuisine at the height of post-war rationing. A post-war rationing in London ended in 1954. And my mother would take her gastronomical expertise to different town halls in England, across the length and breadth of the UK, explaining how these dishes were prepared and talking about Pakistan in a cultural context as well. culminating in a wonderful program with Begum Ikramullah on the Brains Trust. And for those of you who remember the precursor to BBC Radio 4, you will remember that it was called the Home Service. And there again, on the Brains Trust program, she was talking about these recipes. So how did these recipes really come about? Well, I realized after she died that these are probably the first ever paper recipes printed in English. I'm sure there must have been lots of recipes in Urdu, especially cuisine coming from northern India and then adapted, of course, into Pakistan. And she had been asked to prepare these recipes by the Gas Council of Great Britain, which had an arm called the International Kitchen Club. And so every year from 1952 onwards till about 1966, there used to be this Gas Council of Great Britain International Exhibition at Olympia, which some of you will know is in Kensington in London. And she had set up the Pakistan Pavilion there with help, of course, from the Pakistan High Commission. The High Commissioner, Mr. Isfahani, was there in 1954 when she pulled off a public relations coup by persuading Fazal Mahmood, the hero of Pakistan's cricket team, with Wazir and Hanif Muhammad, our two other famous cricketers, to cook some typical Pakistani dishes on the opening day. This brought hundreds of people flocking to the Pakistani pavilion and made the front pages of the then Daily Sketch, now defunct, the Daily Graphic, which was a very popular tabloid at the time, and the Daily Express, which is still around. So my siblings and I decided to compile these recipes into a booklet in memory of our mother's culinary skills. And if you want a copy of the booklet, you can get it from my brother, Ahmad Rashid. My father was my mother's assistant, and he would grow fresh mint and coriander in the garden at the back to get the zaiqa of hara pudina and hara dhania. And she would give my father huge amounts of onion, garlic, and ginger to peel and chop. And he would do it with such finesse that she would never ask anybody else to do it. And I remember my brother and I and my sister, we would raid the larder. In those days, the larder was more important than the fridge. And we would raid the larder to nibble at her tali hui pyaz, which was absolutely delicious. It wasn't fried in oil. It was fried in something she hated called cooking. It came in a sort of packet and she had to fry the pyaz in that. And then her own organizational skills in the kitchen were just mind-boggling. My father would say, oh, somebody's coming for lunch or dinner, and in half an hour, she'd have the traditional keema aloo, matar pulao, and dal prepared within half an hour. The other thing my father was very good at was finely slicing the almonds and the pistachios for garnishing the desserts. He was an expert at kheer, at firni, at zarda, at gajar ka halwa, and of course her signature suji ka halwa, and her legendary, I have to say it, shahi tukre, which in our family were known as imperial parts. And she would always complain about English carrots because they were so orange and they didn't have the redness or the sweetness of the gajar back home. So I think her shahi tukre with their chandi ka varak. Now the chandi ka varak used to be brought from Karachi, And I remember English people coming to our house in London and being absolutely amazed at, but is this edible, real silver paper? And my mother would say, yes, it's wafer thin and it's edible and it's Chandi ka varak. The other thing she was very good at was her innovation at improvising with ingredients that were not available in London. I mean, the nearest halal meat shop was in Whitechapel. There weren't any of these traditional Asian grocery shops that you find now at every corner in every part of London. So she literally would bring suitcases of basmati rice in these huge white linen bags, I remember. She'd bring dal, grams, spices, garam masala. Zafran was, of course, always top of her list, and it had to be Kashmiri zafran or Irani zafran. And then the other amazing feat of hers was that she brought the sil batta. The sil is the huge, very heavy, extremely large grindstone. I still haven't really found a proper English translation for it. And the batta, of course, is the stone with which you would grind the mince for the Shami kebabs. And I remember when these grinders and blenders first came out, and people would say, Paya, as she was known, Paya, why don't you save yourself the trouble of doing the Shami kebab masala on the silbatta and use a grinder? But she had no time for modern gadgets. She was very traditional in the kitchen. And I remember she brought this very heavy havan dasta, pestle and mortar. There is a proper English word for that. And that was used for grinding dried condiments. So everything had to be brought from Karachi. It was only in the 60s and even 70s that Southall, with the growing importance of Heathrow Airport and the Sikh community, that you had the plethora of Asian grocery shops in London. But otherwise, everything would come in her suitcases from Karachi. She maintained her sparkling silver pandan in London, bringing the pan. The betel leaves would be wrapped in a moistened red cotton cloth encased in bamboo sticks to keep the leaves intact and fresh, along with the lime paste, the tuna, the katta, the terra japonica, or katichu as it's known in English, the supari, which you all know, the areca nut. And just after the war, I remember her telling me that the only two vegetables which were readily available in post-war London were tukandar and shaljam, because turnips and beetroot were widely available in post-war London in spite of rationing. So my father was given a diet of chukandar kasalan and shaljam kasalan without meat. Meat was severely rationed in London. I remember my father telling me he would have to go to Ireland, where he would buy the lamb and literally bring it on the plane, you know, literally sort of slung in a bag, these legs of lamb, which would then be cut up and used for different salans and qimas and so. And finally, I don't know how much time I've got, but I just like to share this picture of my brother with Fazal Mahmood, who said to my mother, and this was confirmed by Imtiaz Ahmed in Lahore to me quite a few years back, that I remember how your mother looked after us during our first tour of the UK when we beat England at that famous test match at the Oval in August 1954, and how she looked after us and how she would invite us over for dinner and how we would have all this Pakistani food there. People had no idea about Pakistan, even in 1954. And she really did so much to promote the cause of Pakistan. And she was a remarkable lady and a fantastic cook.
That was wonderful, Sultana, and just brought, I mean, what a story, and how you weaved all the various, family memories, shared memories and recipes. And I think it was a pleasure to hear you. I'll go to Claire now again and maybe move on from the 50s and and the 20th century to the deadly 2020 and the pandemic, which is supposedly and has changed our lives for good. I hope not. But Claire, your writing in this volume also talks about how pandemic has revived this interest in food and given way for experimentation, innovation, and more interest. So just talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, listening to Sultana speak so eloquently, it feels like, what you were saying about post-war rationing and shortages and only having turnips and beetroot. It's something similar. It feels a little bit similar now, if this is our generation's war in a way. I mean, with speaking from the UK, it feels like we've gone back a bit, with the pandemic and Brexit together, and there are, things are lacking in the shops. So there's been, these bouts of panic buying. And I think that the book has struck a chord at this time. It feels as though, I mean, food is a universal language. And it's a love language. It's such an important way in which we communicate across boundaries. And obviously at this time, it's also been a therapeutic activity for people. And, with restaurants either being closed or people worrying about safety, and those businesses, also in a lot of trouble. And you were talking about how much has changed since the 50s. And, in my area, so many South Asian businesses that I'm really worried about, whether they will survive or not, if and when things do return to some kind of normalcy. I think it gets forgotten that Muslims in Britain have been doing a lot to help with food insecurity at this time, and zakat and working to help people. Sikh community was mentioned as well, that they've also been doing a lot in ways that doesn't always get reported. But it was quite noticeable, especially in the first lockdown we had here, that Muslim groups were quick off the mark to help, and especially with homeless people getting food out to them. And so I guess we were already thinking about doing something in this area, but the project had to change a lot because of the pandemic. And Sanam has talked about how her original plans had to be altered. We were all sort of scrambling. We had no access to archives and things. So the anthology is very much a sort of child of the pandemic. When I was writing the introduction, I was wondering if it would be obsolete quite quickly, if it would seem very 2020, very in the past. But unfortunately, things are changing slower than we would have hoped. But I do think food is something that you have to eat. There's no way around it. So it's the one thing that we're not doing, that we have to keep cooking and eating together. And I think bringing people around a table, even if it's virtually in forums like this, food and drink have been a sort of anchor when maybe mental health is frazzling a bit. So I was thinking about all of this, and I hope that some of that comes through in the volume. I think it does. It is a book I'm very proud of, and to have so many 18 fantastic contributors with really different angles, because I think, when you mention food and Muslims, stereotypes come up, there's kebabs and biryanis and kormas, but even in the chapter, Rana's chapter that has the korma, it also has the kalia, and we have the chapter on the burgers that has been discussed. And there's things like malida, bringing together old chapatis and making it into a sweet dish with leftovers. That's quite useful in straitened times like these. So I hope that it gives some sense of a real diversity, and that's across the subcontinent. So I tried to include all three the major places, so India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and also the diaspora of America and Britain, and more besides. So I think that's pretty much all I have to say about the pandemic.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll this later as well. Sanam, I'll ask you about the other chapters and the essays in the book, and if anything that struck you very much. I mean, personally, I love Nadim Aslam's mention of Kachnar, which is these little flower buds that come around in early spring.
I think for me, it was really incredible to see something that brought together such a range of writers and to have these histories of things we've grown up with, or like when Sultana is talking about her mother, it is so important to have those kinds of stories documented. I mean, even just the photographs, looking at them, I wish those were more widely available and people could really read about those kinds of histories and these small stories that are just so fascinating. And I feel like unless you're sitting around the table with your family or in that family, you're not really hearing them. We don't get an opportunity to hear them. I think of my generation, and we don't get that opportunity very often outside of our own families or friends' families. So I was just so happy to be a part of this, where it is this record. I think even coming out of the pandemic and to take on that side of it, to take on things like Rana's chapter on just the kormas. And I think so many people, whether you're in this part of the world or whether you're part of diaspora, to read it, to have a record of it, to have the recipes in there, it's lovely. And I think we should definitely have more and more of these coming out from our part of the world.
Exactly, exactly. So, Rana Appa, I want to ask you two interrelated questions. I mean, one is, of course, Claire mentioned about the stereotype, and that's why I hesitated even in the introduction to put in the word Muslim South Asia or whatever, because, the moment you say that, it invokes all kinds of cliches and, simplistic reductionist ideas about who the Muslims are and what they eat. I mean, like as you know, I've even read about it, that in India, whenever I visited and plenty of times, and even abroad, people assume that Muslims only eat meat. And and so everything is about meat, kebab, biryani, korma, mutton, and given how we live in these extraordinary times where most people can't even afford, to eat meat once a week, let alone every day. So I'd like you to comment a bit on that, or the changing patterns of food and cuisine in contemporary India. And because you also write a lot about these issues, you tweet a lot about, these stereotypes. So I would like you to pick on that and link you to food.
As you said, people normally associate Muslims and meat together. And of course, we do eat it, but now with changing times and also changing incomes and not just time as in, the years, but time as in how much time is available to us. Food has become very different. The food that's served on the table is very different than what was put on my parents' table or what was put on my grandparents' table. So now for us, breakfast is basically, egg and bread, or sometimes, if it's a holiday, so maybe once in a while we'll have some aloo parathas or gobi parathas. Otherwise, it's basically toast and egg every day, because there's no time to sit and cook breakfast. We don't have that kind of household help that we had earlier. And nor do we have the time to make elaborate meals that in the morning, kaleji ban rahi hai or kebab ban rahe hain. So income, time, and convenience has made a lot of difference to the food that we eat. Also, with consciousness of health, now we don't eat so much of non-veg. We my daughter is actually not just a vegetarian, but she's a vegan. So my husband and I, we have both of us, become more or less vegetarian. Once in a while, we eat meat. But as I said, chicken, we are not very fond of. So it's either fish or mutton, but that's not very often. And this is something that's not just for me, but I see it in my family. I see it everywhere around, that people have, the food has changed, what we eat has changed, and how we cook it has also changed. Especially during the pandemic, when there was, initially when I think it was 20th of March 2020 when the lockdown started for us in Delhi, and there was such a panic. We didn't know when the lockdown is going to open, what we are going to be eating. So I remember storing a lot of potatoes and onions and dals and rice and atta. That's something that we can cook every day. So we weren't sure whether we'll be able to get fresh vegetables. Also, at that point of time, we were not sure where the infection is going to come from. So it was a very siege mentality. And I remember in those days, my daughter was with us for that 1 month, and we ate a lot of pastas and potato-based curries and the dry foods which you would keep. And of course, there was no question of any non-veg because we hadn't bought all that. And after that, for a long time, we didn't buy. And even now, every day there's some rumor or the other, that this is contaminated, that may be infected. So we are trying to be as healthy as possible and eat whatever. Like I live on the outskirts of Delhi, so we have a lot of farmers around us. So we buy fresh produce and eat that. And we are trying to eat that. But even on normal days now, the food habits have changed. And we no longer either have the time to cook elaborate meals or to serve elaborate meals. So it's basically dal, roti and sabzi which is eaten every day.
Yeah, it's very, very standard. I have to confess that during 2020, from March to December, I cooked every day, and every day was all about planning what to eat and what to make. So I really, picking on Claire's essay, that's all I did. I lived through it, Claire. So your thesis is completely validated. So, but Rana Appa, I think you mentioned about the tomato-based curries, and you said it with a heavy heart because the UPites do not really approve of tomatoes. They use yogurt for the base. so you said it with a bit of disdain because that's also a nuance in South Asian cooking that we in the Punjab use a lot of tomatoes in everything. All across curries, and it's almost like a sin to use that in Lucknow and other parts of UP, right? Am I right about that?
Because see, tomatoes were introduced by the Portuguese, so they have come late into our cuisine, and by late I mean 400 years ago. And for us, 400 years ago is actually nothing. It's just a moment in time when we are clutching on to our traditions and trying to, especially the Lucknow walas. And I think as more and more life changes, as more and more things keep changing, the more and more you want to clutch on and keep the memories of the past. And I'm also in a way becoming a memory keeper of food, and I keep telling my children, this is how this is done. And my son lives in Berlin. I sent him a lot of recipes, and as I said, my daughter's a non-vegetarian, so it's basically my son who's inheriting all my non-veg cooking skills. And so once a week we have a video call in which I tell him the recipes for the week of how to cook and what to cook. So I think that's nostalgia and memory keeping also which is coming in play.
Yes, indeed, and memory keeper, and that's exactly what Sultana and her brothers have done. Keepers of memories and passing them on. So before I ask Sultana to end our session today, I just want to quickly tell you that I have a friend's mother in Bronx, and they're from Agra in India. That they were migrants from there. And so once we were talking about tomatoes versus yogurt, and she said that, tomatoes are even bad for your health. Don't even touch them. They are not to be used or bought in any form other than a salad. So I just wanted to add to your little description. So Sultana ji, yeah, the final word to you. And you heard Rana Appa's self-confessed memory keeper role. And I guess that's what you have been doing as well. So tell us a little more about how you have used these recipes in your family, in your daily household. Do you cook? And you, how are they used? How do they live on, other than the book, of course?
Well, thank you, Raza. Claire, I enjoyed your book enormously, especially Sanam's essay, and Rana Appa, your essay on Lucknow. Of course, it resonated hugely because my mother was born and brought up there. But I actually am a lousy cook. I was banished from the kitchen very early, having by mistake put surf washing powder into Ammi's kheer when I should have been putting white sugar. So she said, you better just stay away from the kitchen. So I'm actually not a cook, but I'm able to kind of promote her recipes and hand this book out to whoever wants. And I did forget to mention that when you had your LLF in London at South Bank, I think a few years ago, I was able to bring 100 copies of it, and they went like hotcakes. And it was so nice to find people writing to the organizers of the South Bank LLF saying, oh, can we have more of that Begum Pyari Rashid's cookbook? I think the thing about Amni's recipes were that they were very simple. You know, the recipe still says a glass bottle of yogurt. So now, of course, yogurt comes in those little plastic things. But I think what I enjoyed most, Claire, in your book were, of course, all the essays. I thought the essays with the recipes were wonderful. And I just wanted to mention one thing that really struck me, and that was Sadaf Hussein's article, High on Chai and Samosa. This is what she says. Chitrita Banerjee noted that it was the arrival of Muslims which radically reshaped cooking and eating in India. I mean, just that idea, I really latched onto it. The Mughals, no doubt, brought a certain finesse and flair to the already existing Hindustani food, alongside the creation of new and traditional dishes in the royal kitchens. And I'd love to read her book. I've heard about it because of your book. And I do feel that the whole of Rana Appa, I'm sure she'd agree, that UP cuisine was really enhanced by the arrival of Muslims into northern India. And why not mention Muslim in the title, in the subtitle of the book? I thought that was very, very pertinent indeed. And so I think that's a sort of an idea that I perhaps would like to explore. How did the Muslims enhance Hindustani food? And also, perhaps I could just mention, Raza, finishing, that my mother came from Lucknow to England. And so all the recipes in the book are recipes from UP. Then, of course, UP cuisine became incorporated into mainstream Pakistani cuisine. So whereas you had Punjabi cuisine and you had very sophisticated Sindhi cuisine, and you had Baluchi cuisine with sajji and things, and KP, as Claire mentioned. But I think the cuisine of the Muhajirs really was, if you like, the ne plus ultra of finesse and nafasat, and जितना सलीका था पकवान में वो शायद दूसरे पकवान में नहीं था.
True. No, I think you picked up a great thread in the book, because in my own book on Delhi, I mean, there's a whole, I devote a couple of chapters to food and how so many things were brought to Delhi by Muslims. Of course, now we're in a revisionist mode, so everything is evil on that side, with Muslims coming into India. But, paneer, for example, cheese, they also link it to some of the Persian cooks, and now it's the most popular dish, served in northern India. There's paneer kofta and paneer with vegetables, and the origins are pretty dubious, if I may say so. But anyway, I think we have to conclude this session, and the fact that we are in different time zones, different countries, and what has brought us together is Claire's marvelous anthology, Desi Delicacies, and we all are talking about burgers and UP recipes and kaliyas and and whatnot. So I guess that's the power of food, and as Claire Chambers rightly said, it's a language, it's a universal language and language of love. And certainly, it keeps not only shapes but also reshapes our memories and our shared experiences and shared pasts. So, with that, I thank you all for being here. And please do get a copy of this book because it's a must read. I've been loving since I started reading it, and I hope you'll enjoy it too. And thank you, to LLF once again for having us speak about food and what we love.